Wendy, welcome to the DNA of Music version in quarantine. Thank you for being with me today.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you are in Toronto right now, right?
Yes, that's right. I am in Toronto, and I've been in Toronto for the last 10 years or so. Before that, I was actually in Vancouver. I started my music journey when I was in China, so when I was 5. Um, I did not pick my instrument, my parents did.
Oh, wow. Mhm.
So, the area that I'm from in China, they are famous for this version of playing and singing with the pipa, which is I'm going to show you a little bit later. And the pipa was like it's almost like a TV show, like olden times, like TV show where people would go every day afternoon to a tea house and they will be sipping tea, and there will be 2 performers. One is on another instrument called 3 string. That's the name, 3 strings, and the other one is going to be on pipa. And they just take turns singing in their dialect and about a portion of the story, and then the next day it's the next portion of the story. So it's like olden time TV shows, and people that's like the tradition. That's a tradition, and that's what I grew up learning. That's what I first started being introduced to that instrument, and I was also taking vocal lessons at that time. Then when things get a little bit hectic in life, I have to drop one, and I kept the instrument, and I dropped the vocal lessons.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's amazing. So, like, I guess for many musicians, and I assume like in China it would be even more because of family tradition and the focus on traditions. Like even in Western world, so many people start with piano because their parents make them learn it, and then they either love it or they transition into other instruments. But you end up loving an instrument and keeping it, right?
Yeah, so I actually started with the traditional instrument and then transitioned to piano because my parents want me to get a more well-rounded music education, traditional being a part of it, and also learning and understanding chords and Western notations and Western ways of like thinking about music, right? So that it's not a one-sided thing. So I would say that it is my privilege and put me in a very special area of expertise, especially in Canada, where um, I know both. I know the music theory for both traditional as well as Western. I know how every single instrument is sounded in the Chinese orchestra as well as the Western orchestra. And it kind of helped me in my journey when I was exploring more composition, conducting, that type of like things in my music career. And it definitely played a big role in that.
Hmm. What's the I know more of like Arabic, Turkish, Persian, and then of course Western music too. And I only heard Chinese music, and of course I love the people, which is why I wanted to get you in the show. But I'm not really sure about how the music like theory and approach to music works in Chinese music. So it would be a sort of a broad question, so you can like attack it any way you want. But I assume the scales will be very different, and of course the instruments will be different. But what would you say would be like a general idea of how like music in traditional music in China is portrayed as opposed to what people would be more familiar with in the Western world?
Yeah, so when I transitioned to piano and learning about Western music and all that stuff, one of the things I noticed that's very different is Chinese music, Chinese pieces in general, they are describing a scene, they are describing a object, they're describing something like a little bit poetic, and you can almost hear whatever they're describing, and whatever they're describing is in the title. So they, in terms of the pieces, I find that Chinese music, especially the classic traditional ones, are more describing and like scenic stuff, right? So you can guess what the piece is about. You can guess what the composer meant. And in terms of the Western ones, it's fantasia, it's sonata, it's, you know, things like that, where it's patterns, it's more music theory, it's more technical, and a less focus on what the actual notes and every single piece of the tone is supposed to feel like in a grand scheme of things, right? So that's definitely one thing that's a little bit different. In terms of tones, yes, we use a predominant like pentatonic scale, and that shows up a lot of the times in traditional music. But it doesn't mean that we don't touch the F and the B or the sharps and flats. It's just that we would prefer, if to make it more sound traditional, we would actually actively choose the pentatonic notes rather than the F and the Bs and the sharps and the flats. In terms of scales, it's really unique, where it's what we call a movable do or a movable one. So this is something that when I was learning piano, I had a difficult time with, because scales in Chinese traditional music is just so simple. It's you learn one scale, you learn the fingering for one set of the scale, and you just keep on moving it, keep on shifting it in order to compensate for the other keys. So you don't actually ever think in sharps and flats. You always move the scale to create a new scale. That's basically what that is. And we hardly ever do sharps and flats because of that.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, and that's something I've seen one show once a while back. That was my first introduction to Pipa, actually. That was a lute, an oud, and a pipa, and they were trying to combine this like Middle Eastern, then Chinese and Western music in one. And it was a very interesting experiment. And the first thing that I thought was like, because I didn't know about the pentatonic scales in Chinese music, but especially even in like Arabic maqams, right? You have even the quarter tones, and you have even, I dare say, even more, let's say, more options, more complicated than major or minor scale. But one of the things that I noticed with the Pipa also, and one thing that you're mentioning of this scenic idea building, like when I was listening to a couple of pieces on the Pipa, they were very much like, as you said, like you could be on, like there was one piece that was like sort of like they were on a lake, and then you have this like of mountains and rivers, and you had this, you're trying to like translate to music this feel that you have when you are in those environments, right? And I thought that was quite fascinating. And how does it work in terms of like your training for Pipa? Because the instrument will show like in a bit, but it's a quite unique one, and you actually play it like upright, and instead of having frets, let's say the place where you place your fingers are sort of like carved into the instrument itself. How was your experience learning it when you were growing up?
Yeah, when I was learning it, it's a bit because I was taught like the traditional way, right? So the classical way of like playing the pipa. So um, it's a bit like, because I was younger, it was a bit like seeing what the teacher does and then just copying exactly what it is. I didn't really go through my mind as to why certain thing has to be that way. And now that I am a teacher in Toronto and I actively teach students, young and old, about some of the techniques, and it's less about copy, especially the older adults when they start learning that instrument, picking up that instrument. It's more about telling them why things are the way it is, and that makes me think and make me realize that a lot of the techniques, in order to play it properly, there is a reason why it has to be that fingering, that technique, that way of like playing, right? So this is now I'm starting to realize. I've been doing this for years, but I never actually stopped and thought about why. So in terms of like playing the pipa itself, it has a very high threshold for learning at the very, very beginning, because there's this technique called Lun. Lun is basically, this is my right hand. The right hand usually goes on the bottom, and then the left hand is the one that we were holding and then pressing on the fret. So the right hand, the difference between, say, classic guitar and us is that a lot of our technique goes outwards. So classic guitar goes inwards like this. A lot of our technique goes outwards like that. So we are actually using the nail bed. We actually have fake nails like this. I purposely didn't actually like put it on, but we have fake nails like outside of our fingers, because our string is completely steel. Like after I play a song without my fake fingernails, it's actually gonna like shave off a layer of my fingernails if I don't have protection. So because of that, and because of our technique, so one, going back to what I was talking about learning curve, is that it's going 1, 2, 3, 4, and then when you go the thumb, everything comes back. And then we do that in rapid succession in order to do a tremolo, right? So
wow.
this technique is very, very unique to this instrument, and also very difficult because we're trying to train our fingers to sound exactly the same, whether or not if it's tonations or the strength of our fingers, because we know like our muscles are different in our palms, so we have to micro adjust almost to the point that every single finger, when it comes out and strike the string, it sounds the same. So the goal is when you close your eyes, you shouldn't be able to tell which finger played that. No. So because of how difficult that technique is, a lot of people deem pipa as one of the hardest Chinese instrument to learn. And hardly ever any song that we have, like in terms of our repertoire, hardly any song that doesn't have that technique, because it's such a most basic technique that you may have, or also will just be plugging. So I think they're in my repertoire book, and I have a few of them, only 1 or 2 songs and all the maybe finger exercise that might not contain that technique, but like you can play nothing if you did not master that technique.
Oh wow, that's amazing, and that's just even the right hand, because what I saw like on the left hand, and we'll show it later, the notes are sometimes a bit even further apart, because it's somewhat of like a long instrument. So it's not like you can do little, like it's not like all the notes are too close by. They're actually sort of further apart. I guess a good moment to actually showcase the instrument, I guess. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So now we're talking about it, we can put a face to it. I'm going to scroll back a little bit so you can see more of it. So the head, usually traditionally, this is the ivory, or would be using ivory, but ivory has been banned, so this now is like plastic. But I still do have an older pipa that's made before the 2000s, where ivory was used, and it's really beautiful, but it really is just a piece of decoration at this point. These are the tuning pegs, and in the olden times, the tuning pegs are used from materials like the ox horn, so rare materials to be used for that. But now it's just whatever the wood is. So this is a red African redwood, old red cedar, old mahogany, obviously will have better sounds. So that would be different grades of pipa. So this is usually the material for the pipa. And then when you go down further, these are the frets, and the frets are usually made of bamboo on the outer side. So the outer side of the bamboo is harder. So when you're actually using the string to do like vibrato and stuff like that, it doesn't chip a dent in there, right? So it's softer on the inside. So we're using the outside of the bamboo for that. So it looks like this, the rest of it. So this, like every single instrument has to have a sound box in order to make the sound. So this instrument is so carefully, so uniquely crafted that you don't actually see a sound box, right? So this is the back of it, and if I put it on the side, you will see that it's not that, it's a little bit hollow. It's hollow here, but it's not hollow up here, okay? And the sound box itself is actually hidden right underneath, let's see if I can show you, underneath here. So it's actually in here. The sound box is so tiny that a lot of the times our instrument is meant for a chamber type of setting rather than a big, like it doesn't boom, right? So if you, even though we can play super intensely, but the sound doesn't travel that far due to the fact that our sound box is so small. Most of the time, a mic is probably needed in order to amplify the sound for this instrument. Yeah.
Perfect. That's amazing. So thank you for showing the pipa. It's such an interesting and beautiful instrument in all senses. And just before we actually show how it sounds, I know that there are like stories of the pipa being used for the last, let's say, like 2,000 years. I think I read something about like Han Dynasty, like which is contemporary of the Roman Empire, and they would have an instrument sort of like the pipa, but then I guess it was a bit later that the current construction of it became like sort of like somewhat standardized. Can you talk a little bit about like just the history of the instrument, like so people can have an idea of how ancient it is?
Yeah, of course. So this instrument is, yeah, like you said, it has about like 2,000 years of history. It's actually not originally from China. Originally from China, it's another instrument called the ron. So if you think of the ron, it's kind of like a cheese wheel with a little stick on top. That's what actually it looks like. And the ron is actually traditionally central China, but this is actually combined with I believe it's the oud from the Silk Road, or like one of the pluck instruments from Persia through the Silk Road more than 2,000 years ago. And when it came to China, it got combined with the traditional Chinese ron in order to formulate this instrument called Pipa, P-I-P-A. So this instrument is not technically like origin from China, but over the years it has very like kind of like changed the way that it's made as well as the way it's being played. So in before, like any sort of lute, it's played sideways like guitar, everything like that. However, the more that we start decorating the top half, the more we elongated it as well. So it's a lot smaller in ancient China. The fret is only like a lot shorter too, so it doesn't have that wide of a range. So people started to play it upright because the head started getting taller, it started getting heavier. Holding it sideways is actually making position changes very difficult. So people started putting it on their laps. Traditionally, too, in the Han Dynasty and all the dynasties after that, it's used as a way. It's almost like a very artistic type of instrument. It's not something that you find in street corners or commoners who can learn it. Only privileged musicians can learn this instrument, and it's only being played at court. So a lot of the pieces are very high end. A lot of the pieces, even traditional pieces that we have, are more like describing how like this um, lady, this court lady who's like dancing, like in order to accompany a dinner, that type of thing. So those are just because this instrument is mainly used to entertain the foreign ambassadors when they're visiting China back in the days, and also entertain whoever is at court. Because of that, not many people actually played this, and this has a really, it has the privilege of being developed over time. A lot of the other type of thing, like bamboo flutes and stuff like that, a lot of people, a lot of the commoners in the olden times played them, so they use different type of bamboo, and that's the reason why they have different type of like sizes of it, but it hasn't really developed over time. It's like the structural is still the same because of how high up this is in terms of the chords. They had people actually research on how to make the sound better, how to make the like the range larger, and what type of like songs that can be played, the composition and stuff like that. So yeah.
No, that's amazing, and it's so interesting that probably also like as the instrument traveled from one place to another is such well, as you are in Toronto and you play with all kinds of musicians, and it's actually sort of like a recurring theme in this show with everybody that I talk about, that is whenever you look back you will see that like ideas for how to make music, they traveled, and then certain cultures make it their own, to the point that today whenever you think of a pipa and what has been done with it over like what 2000 years, it became something that is like part of the tradition. And it's interesting what you're saying about it being presented to people from abroad. So it's sort of like we grab the things, we make our own, and we present to people with a unique sound that can't be found in any other kind of instrument. Yeah, that's and one thing that I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned the Silk Road, and that's kind of just reminded me that I read somewhere that probably not these days, but apparently the strings for the pipa were at some point actual silk, right?
Yes, absolutely. So the one thing that's really unique about all Chinese instrument, actually I can't say all, most Chinese instrument, is they actually don't have any metal on there. So except for the strings nowadays, because it produce better sounds, we have steel strings. Nothing on my instrument is actually metal. So that's why it's called silk and bamboo. So that's a very common name for a lot of Chinese instruments or Chinese instrument ensembles that you will hear about across North America. Because the olden times, the strings are silk, and bamboo is the material that's used most commonly to make these instruments, like flute and like the frets on here. Like my bridge is bamboo, right? So everything is like it's held together by glue. It's held together by that, like those type of things. Nothing metal on here whatsoever. And that tradition, except for the strings nowadays, that has kept up over the years for sure.
And I guess the strings made of metal, they were like chosen for getting like better sound, but still like emulate the kind of resonance that you would have with like even in like the oud or other instruments, they would have gut strings or things like that, which were probably not very durable. And they assume with silk would be sort of the same. Does it change the sound that much from silk to metal, or is it somewhat similar?
It's actually very different. A silk string is a lot softer, a lot like if you think of the sound, it goes inwards more. So we already don't amplify that much, even with a metal string. So silk will actually just kind of like cocoon the sound around you. So the only people who can actually hear you is probably the person who's sitting right next to you. So, and the other thing is that silk can't be pulled as taut as steel does. So a lot of the higher end notes doesn't come out. So a lot of the pitches don't quite get to where we want some of the songs to be at. So I don't know how how the olden times, how the sound waves affected the instrument, but I do know that because this string is metal. Depending on how I play it, sometimes if I don't be careful, the sound will go more splat than being round, and that splat actually cause a sound wave inside the hollow part of the instrument that kind of makes the instrument sound a little bit less round. So the more you don't be careful about the way you play the sound tonation, the more you're kind of like ruining your instrument. So this is not like piano where older it is, the more valuable it is. Actually, the lifespan of a typical pipa is about 10 to 15 years. Now, after that, that has to be changed because the sound pattern inside the hollow, like carves kind of like waves inside the wood on the inside, and that kind of influence the way that pipa sounds.
Oh, that's amazing. That's so interesting. Oh, that's so cool. So I guess it would be a good time for us to show how like the pipa sounds. So feel free to just like maybe showcase like technique, or maybe play like a song, or like a piece of something that you think would be interesting. I guess we could get into that. And I guess you have to put your nails, right?
Yeah, I'm doing that right now as we talk.
That's amazing.
So the nails is just it's just like plastic right now, but plastic is what I usually use in order to practice. But for performances and stuff like that, we sometimes use turquoise shell type of like nails in order to have a more crisp and clean sound. These nails are shaped towards like everyone's like fingers, so it's not like one size fits all. You kind of have to do your own little nail filing and all that stuff. And we use I use like a medical cloth tape in order just to tape it, but there are like more tapes out there nowadays for people to use, but this is how I grew up learning it, and that's usually the tape that I prefer over some of the plastic ones out there now. So
and I think if I'm not mistaken, it goes the tune. You probably have different kinds of tuning, right? But it goes from A to A, or like how do you tune it usually?
So just give me a second.
Sure.
I don't have fine tuners, so everything has to be like. So like a tiny bit of like the tunation that's off, sometimes you have to use other ways in order to get it exactly right. So fine tuners would be preferred, but honestly, no metals, right? So we can't have fine tuners. All right, so I'm actually going to move this back a little bit. I'm hoping that you can see more of me. Ideally, I would. Here, let me do something like this.
Yeah, and we'll link to on the show notes for the show. We're gonna link to like performances of yours, and so that people can continue their like exploration of the instrument. But that's perfect. That's a perfect angle.
Sure. Yeah. So this instrument has a bit of range. So if you hear that, that's a lowest note, and that's A. It's the one A below middle C. So not the one immediately below middle C, but the one after that. So one octave below middle C. And the highest one up here, it's about, it's a E, I think. And it's about like maybe 2 octaves above middle C.
Oh, so it's a good range.
Yeah. It's a very, very good range right now. So like I said, it's not always like that, but over the years they developed so many. And some people, like, depend on how intense they are and what type of music they play. A lot of the time, contemporary music nowadays that are being composed for people require the musician to even add a slightly more, one more down here, so they actually get a little bit more range out of it too. So overall, that's basically the range of the pipa, but the most common key is actually D. D major is the most common key, and before I actually start, I want to show you what that movable doll that I was telling you about. And that's, so we learn, this is how we learn it. This is first position, and we learn that the scale, say do, re, mi, fa, sol in D. So that's how it looks like. And when we shift key, say E major. E major, we just shift down. And the F major, G major. So we just keep on shifting. So in our concept, in our theory, we are always shifting the first tonic, and we will say that the tonic now is become a 1. So the do, right? So we keep on shifting and shifting down, so we never think in sharps and flats. That has its benefit and also has its like everything, pros and cons, right? So in terms of reading Western notations and stuff like that, our brain isn't wired the same. So whenever we see so many sharps and flats, it will take us a while in order to think like what type of key is in. Sometimes you will see people actually write down numbers to transpose the what we see as a C major into another key, because that's how they hear it, right? So you will see a lot of traditional Chinese musicians actually write their own music for that reason.
And that's one thing, like just a little segue, but it's interesting. Was there in China, because I know, for example, for Middle Eastern music, most of the notations came from Western influence, at least on the 17th century. They had in Baghdad in the 9th, 10th, 11th century, they had some sort of notation for music, for the maqams and everything, but it was adapted in the Ottoman Empire to have like written music with Western notations or a variation of it. In China, you have like an independent creation of notations, or is it something brought from the West? I'm always curious to know.
As if I recall my history, it's not, it's independent actually. It's developed independently. It's all in numbers. It's not based on anything that is from the Western society, but then I think it as the Chinese culture gets more ingrained in the West with the Western society, they kind of standardized it across the board so that it can be relatable, right? So the original development is not from Western influence. The original development is their own, so they use numbers. So there is no like notes and stuff like that. So maybe some of the rhythm got standardized, because I know that our rhythm is exactly the same how we notate rhythm. But everything else, like it's not, it has very few like similarities, right? In that sense.
No, it's very interesting. And so then you were talking, can you demonstrate like the technique of the plucking on the right side, on the right hand? Because that's very interesting.
Yeah, so right hand is this one, and right hand down here. So our P and Pa, Pipa, this instrument is actually named after the two techniques that we usually use. So P is when we go first finger outwards like this, and Pa is when our thumb goes out like this. So that's the most basic techniques where we're taking turns doing this. And that's the basic plucking techniques that we have. And the other most basic technique is lunge. So what that is that we can all try this. It's like a loose fist that you have, so it's nothing like hard fist. So it's a hard fist, and then loosen up a little bit so that you see a little bit kind of like a hollowness. And then all you need to do is you go out one at a time. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then when the thumb goes out, everything comes back like that. And then when the first finger goes out, the thumb goes back like that. And then if you go do it faster and faster and faster, and then you kind of like circulate that into.
Oh, it's amazing.
Right? So that's why if you don't master that, you actually will have a hard time learning some of the repertoires in this on this instrument. But once you know how to play the 轮指, everything else is a lot simpler. So it's just that first initial threshold that you have to get over.
It would probably be somewhat equivalent to learning how to master the bow when you're playing like violin or other like string instruments that require a bow, because the like micro adjustments you have to have on your hand and the weight on the strings. But this sounds very especially because you have to keep you make it look very simple, but like to have the same strength on this finger or on this finger, it will be very, very challenging. But I guess when you master it, you unlock all these things that you can do with the pipa. And you play like each finger will play in one specific string.
Yeah, so every single finger is on the same string when we're using that technique. And we're also trying to, because the goal is to make everything sound equal, right? So we're also trying to make all 5 fingers land on one single place on the string, so that like any sort of string instrument, if you play more up top versus playing more towards a bridge, it sounds different. So we're trying to make sure that everything is like as closely as possible so that it sounds unison. And that's hard. That's hard because your finger doesn't exactly go
right
on point.
And then, let's say that you want to do some sort of like, besides like actually playing the note, like, would you do some sort of like, for example, in other string instruments, you'll have like glissandos, or you'll have other like techniques on the left hand. Do you do that kind of thing on the pipa as well, or you're trying to make the notes as like precisely the same sound as possible? Like, would you do techniques on the left hand? It's basically sort of what I'm asking.
Absolutely. And sometimes our thumb and stuff like that can do other things, like
That's amazing. Mm-hmm.
So that is like when your thumb is actually doing other things as like on the different strings in order to bring out different type of melody and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. So the other finger continue on the first string while the thumb goes all over the place.
That's amazing, and thank you for showing that. That's it's such a beautiful, magical instrument. It's I always love it when I hear it. And so, when you were playing the pipa, as you mentioned, like traditionally would be voice and this other instruments. You mentioned it's called 3 strings. What would be the name in Chinese?
三弦, right?
三弦, okay.
三弦, yeah. So 3 strings. This is like what we call it's a special thing called 评弹. So 评弹 is like this. Even a lot of Chinese people don't even know about this because it's so cultural arts type of thing, where it's usually a lady like myself playing the pipa, a guy who plays the 三弦. So it looks like a little sound box, like about this big. It has a very, very long neck, and it's very slanted like that. So it doesn't have frets. A lot of sliding is done on that instrument. So that instrument has usually played by a guy, and usually it's us, like those type like a woman and a man, in order to articulate this story. And when one person's singing, the other person's playing all the background type of thing, and while one person's singing and the other one plays the background. So that's usually how that goes. Yeah.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's so interesting. And actually, this relationship to storytelling and to setting the mood for stories is very cool. And then you mentioned that you're part of like I think the Chinese orchestra in Toronto, right? So how does it work? Like, is it a more modern phenomenon to have like ensembles or orchestras in Chinese music? Yeah.
Yeah, so actually Chinese orchestra has a history of like less than 50 years. Just because like we Chinese instruments are not made to be played together. So it's one of the Western influences that comes into the music culture in China, and then they go like, well, you know what? We have so many different instruments. Let's make an ensemble together. And what they quickly realize is that every single instrument is actually made for solo. It's not made for um,
Accompaniment, harmony.
accompaniment, right? So a lot of the times we lack bass, we lack rhythmic type of like things. Usually it's like the pluck instrument does the rhythmic stuff, but we definitely don't have good enough bass. So in Chinese orchestra, you will see bass and cello. We borrow bass and cello in order to be able to compensate for that. A lot of new Chinese instruments were developed as a as a result of trying to fit into an orchestra. One of it is like it's called hu, right? So hu is basically what we commonly hear is erhu. Erhu is two strings, and it's the Chinese equivalent of like a violin, basically. And different sizes will have different pitches. So in order to accommodate for that lower bass sound, they actually developed like what we call like a huge, humongous like hu. Basically, that's a Chinese version of the cello in a way. And Chinese instrument, like for example, if you think of, we have four classes. We have the wind instruments. We don't have brass. Remember, we don't have metal, so we don't actually have brass. The closest one that we may have is called suona. Suona is a very loud, very obnoxious. It's usually used for like weddings and funerals and all that stuff, or announcements usually, and that's the closest that we ever have to any sort of brass instrument. But mostly it's woodwinds. And then we have the erhu section, or the hu section, which is the strings. And then we have the pluck section. Pluck section is actually very unique to Chinese orchestra. And we have this, we have the guzheng, which is the harp, we have the dulcimer, we have the ran, which is like more of a rounding sound. I have a ran. If we're interested, we can like
for sure. Yeah.
Look at what that sounds like too. And then we have like a tiny version of this as well. It's called liu qin. It's very high pitched. It's like the piccolo to the flute, if you think of it that way. And then, so that's majority of the pluck instrument. And then we have the bass section, which we borrow from the Western orchestra, right? So, and then obviously we also have the percussion instrument. And percussion for us it's a lot of really unique type of percussion instruments that you might not even ever seen, right? It's not as simple as triangle and the bells and all that stuff. We have the gong, we have like different like plate looking things, and
yeah, that's one thing, because I'm a percussionist, so I'm always like, the only thing that I've delved into a little bit was, but they are like from like the taiko drums from Japan. But in China, I've seen so many things that I was like, that's the next thing to learn. But in terms of rhythm, I actually don't know exactly like how is the approach to rhythms in terms of like in Chinese music. Like for example, in like Brazilian music, like where I'm from, there's a lot of twos and fours, and we have usually a big ensemble of people playing, so that you can do syncopations and you can do like multiple rhythms on top of each other. And whereas you have like in Arabic music or Persian music, you have a lot of like sixes and nines and sevens, and you have all this like different kinds of rhythms that you have one person soloing on top of a bass. How does it work in Chinese music? I'm curious. Like,
that's a very good question. That's a really good question. So in Chinese music, it's very traditional. Let's talk about traditional. Let's not go into the contemporary stuff. So traditional, we have very simple rhythm. How like it's the 2, 3, 4s, right? However, what's really unique about Chinese rhythm is that we like the offbeats. So especially pluck instrument, you all hear them going like da, 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 a lot of the times. And usually the first beat, the downbeat, is done by the the bass. So either the run, which I'm going to show you, or the cello plucking. So you all see that when cello is used in Chinese orchestra, a lot of the times they are not bowing, they are plucking. So they're doing the first beat of the downbeat, where the pluck section, like myself, will do the offbeat, and then we'll have the erhus and the Chinese like bamboo flutes in order to overlay on top, right? So that's the pattern that you see most commonly in an orchestra. So in terms of individual instruments, that's something different too. So like I said, the orchestra is done within the last 50 years. So they developed something that's uniquely them, that defines them, which is the offbeats. The solo instruments wise, a lot of the rhythm is still like the 2-3-4s, nothing very complex. But a lot of it has, what's unique about it is the pulls. Well, especially in Pipa, I can't, like the other instruments might not be the same, but on Pipa, it's the pulling the strings, the stealing of the time, the rubato. So you all see that a lot of our pieces actually have a rubato beginning, or rubato middle, or rubato end. So we actually, there will be times where a lot of the music are not two time. It's with a loose structure of time, and you kind of can't steal time within a bar, or steal time within a 4 bars, period of 4 bars, in order to land on exactly the same, like maybe 8 bars later, something like that, right? So that's so.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah, and this like letting time float, especially when you have like when you have a soloist, it just makes time be more complex than in other situations. So interesting. So one thing before we show the other like instrument you're mentioning, maybe we can show a little bit of how it doesn't have to be like a full piece, but like a little bit of like a traditional melody that would be like something that a person would like know that it's like a pipa sounding tune. I think that would be interesting to show. And if you wanted to do any context with it, because you mentioned that they always have like something to do with like a story or setting up a scene. So if you wanted to mention something before you show the piece, that'd be amazing.
Yeah, of course. So 2 things. I usually showcase 2 different types, just because you all see that Pipa has 2 very, very distinctive sides. One's more artsy type, where it's like more soft and all that stuff, and the other one's more like battle-like, right? So, or joy-like, more rhythmic, bring out the more plug section of the piece. So we're actually going to start with the more gentle one. So I'm going to put a section. This is not, it's traditional, but it's more from one of the tribal area in China, and this piece is called the Dance of the Yi tribe. And I'm just gonna take the main melody from it and showcasing what a very beautiful like type of melody would sound like. So this one is taking like the Yi tribe's like theme like of what they like. Every single tribe has their own vocal theme in order to differentiate that they're from this tribe versus that tribe. And then there's so many minority tribes in China. So this is from the Yi people. And what they are very distinctive about is that they have a hand drum. So usually the hand drum in that tribe is used to keep the beat. So in this little motif or melody that you will hear, the hand drum is the bass note, and that's going to keep up with the beat once every single bar or so. All right?
Amazing.
Yeah, let's hear it.
Wow. Bravo, bravo. That's it's so beautiful. It's so amazing, so interesting. And one thing that I'm curious about, is there a lot of like improvisation on the pieces when you're playing it? Are you playing it on the like very specific like notes and the patterns, or are you improvising a little bit in between notes or things? How does that work on the pipa?
Not traditionally. So in the more classical training pieces, no, you don't get to improvise. They will write the notes without rhythm. They will write it with dotted like bar lines in between in order to tell you that this is to your interpretation of the rhythm, not the actual notes. The notes are written out. So
Mhm.
when like even then there will be rhythm, suggested rhythm. So it's kind of like you will hear just now there's like a bit of like time stealing from time to time, and that is, but then you kind of like get on board right away, right? So it's not like you're stealing time to the point that you kind of delay everything else. You steal time but then you kind of get back to it, that type of thing. So that happens quite a bit in Chinese music, especially in folk. Less so in orchestra because that would be very hard to conduct. So
Right. No, that's cool. And one thing, like before, because you mentioned that there is like this more like war-like song that you're going to show, but one thing that I was thinking, one thing you mentioned about having like this duo, and you have like the male and the female playing, and that's one of the things that I noticed that most players that I have seen for pipa, they are female players, right? So it's traditionally a female instrument. Is that still the case for in pipa, or how does that work these days?
yeah, in the olden days, definitely a female thing, right? So it's not like a guy can pick it up and not be mocked. Nowadays, it's both gender neutral. It's just that guys don't usually like, because especially when Chinese people have very traditional Chinese family, they will not really allow the guy to pick up an instrument like this. However, I have had male students, and I have all the really good pipa players in the world. Most of them, when you look at them, it's like at least half of it is guys. So the reason why is because a lot of strength has to be used for um, some of the pieces, some of the really big pieces, right? So um, guys sometimes can bring out that um, feel better than girls can actually. I remember that for a while the competition when I was younger, because the piece was like 30 minutes long and most of it's battle like stuff, that I had to train by swimming laps every single day in order to have that arm strength in order to be able to play that piece. So things like that actually requires a lot of strength. Even though that we make it look easy, it's years and years of like strength training.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah, it's but in a way, it has that feel. I was even looking at some like miniatures, some paintings of like older times with like women playing the pipa, and in a way, it's interesting to see that since it's such a difficult instrument to learn, it's something that in older times, it's like women would be basically brought up to actually learn and play and master that instrument. And I guess even in terms of the discipline that is needed, right? Especially, let's say if you have like hands that are not that strong, you'd have to really go like really practice to be able to create those sounds. So in that sense, the challenge of learning the instruments, it's already a part of the gift you get with it, I assume.
Yeah, so this instrument has a lot of like all musicians. The depend on how many hours you put into it, there are different type of injury that can happen with practicing and all that stuff. So one of the things with this instrument is actually back, right? So when you saw how I was playing before, I was leaning forward, I was like turning my head, and a lot of the times it's the spine that's like curving around. So people actually do, like, depend on how long you practice and how often you practice, people actually get a bit of like back problems because of it. And like different like girls in general, like they um the reason why traditionally they use girls for these is because they bring out the more softer sound of the pipa, which is what's needed for a lot of the dances and the chords. And like like when you're dining, you don't want to hear battle type of like music, right? You want to hear something softer and all that stuff. So as the repertoire developed a little bit more into more storytelling, less about scenery type of description, that's when the battles come out. That's when the strums come out. That's when the rhythm thing come out. But we lost a lot of those music in the Cultural Revolution back in the late 1900s and stuff like that. Where they burnt a lot of arts, they burnt a lot of paintings, they burnt a lot of like music and all that stuff. So a lot of arts were lost. And then you see in our repertoire nowadays, a lot of like new translated or new variation of. So that means they completely lost the score, and whoever knew the music just kind of like rewrote it out of memory. So it's not really the original thing; it's a variation of, right? So you see that play into our whole culture as well, that we actually lost a lot of culture during that time.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah, it happens in a lot of cultures, like specifically, like just to compare, like here in Kiev, where I am right now, they have bandura, that is an instrument that is also played. It's a different technique, but it also had like very specific way of playing it and very specific people. It was like these blind monks that would walk around the country playing and do it. It's a very interesting story. But then when the Soviet Union took over, they basically changed the instrument, literally changed like how it would sound and would look, and persecuted those people. So a lot of the songs, they just survived in a few villages, and now there is like a revival to try to find them, but it's very hard to see how authentically they were playing, like, I don't know, 300-400 years ago. So it's interesting how in one instrument you can find the whole history of a culture.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's one thing I love about my repertoire, is because as I go through the repertoire, you learn about the story behind some of the pieces, and like, whoa, like I had no idea that this actually happened in the history. Like, for example, I was playing this song called Night of like the Torch Festival. It's a very happy song. You would never think that it's about slavery rising up against the slave owners by burning them, and that's the Torch Festival, right? So they still have that once a year, the Torch Festival, in minority tribal song. But then that song is so happy, you would never think that that's the history of it. So when you learn, one of the things, this is called score study. You see it in conducting, you see it in I teach my students this. I don't think everyone does, but I definitely do teach my student this, where when you get a new piece in Chinese music, you research the history and the story behind it, because that will actually make you connect to why certain melody is the way it is, right? It teaches you a story. It tells you the history of your culture as well as the Pipa's culture or Pipa's history, and kind of like make you understand that the stories, the music in the stories, the music is not just sounds, it's connected bigger than that. It tells a story, can use it to describe a scenery, can describe a feeling, some of the, like, for example, I don't know if this instrument is not the best in terms of performing arts, but I'll try it. So things like that in a piece actually describe like ladies crying, right? So that's like that type of sound effect is legit like describing a very sad scene, right? And it's about them crying and shaky at the same time. So if you understand that this part of the music is about sadness, about this person crying over their lost lover and stuff like that, then you won't be able to play that with more feeling, right, and all that stuff. So score study is very important in Chinese music, in my opinion, because you get to really understand what you're playing.
That's so interesting. It's such a unique way of seeing it, and I guess that also influences the fact that if you start listening to a lot of the music and getting like ingrained in the culture, you start noticing what kind of like codifying there is in the music, and that will unlock a lot of next time, for example, that I will hear like music from Pipa, I will look for those details, and then you'll feel it, just as you were mentioning, like when you're learning the instrument, and then you can infuse that meaning into the way you're playing, even sometimes subconsciously, and even when you're listening to it now, it's like, oh, it's about this specific like sadness. And one thing that maybe we can show this like this other side of the Pipa in a way that is this more, let's say, I heard like, there is even like warlike like things that it's like they're actually talking about moments of conflict, or even you mentioned also moments of joy, and sometimes even combining the two that make it a very interesting thing. Can you show us like some something on that like other spectrum of the Pipa?
Yeah, I'll show you a more joyful thing. So it's more rhythmic, and you hear the rhythmic aspect of it. This song's called "Give Me a Rose." I'm just gonna do half of it, so that way we can save on a little bit of time.
Of course. Oh, amazing! That's so beautiful. Thank you for showing us that. That's so cool, and it shows also this like creativity that you can have also, like using the soundboard and using the. You were doing even some like using the top of the strings. It's amazing. Thank you for showing that.
Yeah, thank you for noticing. Yeah, so this piece is really unique in that sense that it actually showcases a lot of aspect of weight, like the more rhythm. So you can like touch the board to produce a more percussion type of sound. And the other thing that you can do with this piece, yeah, it's really rhythmic in a way. It's not pentatonic scale. If you notice, this is
Yes.
more, yeah, more with the sharps and the flats, and more kind of like a more tribal type of sound as well. So this piece is called "Give Me a Rose," and it's talking about this guy who has no idea how to tell the girl that he loves that he likes her and want to date her and all that stuff. So instead of telling her, he went out and handpicked a rose, and he's just kind of like working himself up and be happy but nervous at the same time about giving that rose to the girl. So that's the story behind it. It's
Oh,
really
that's so cool. Oh, I will. One thing I want to do, like with this project, like as we go, is to actually showcase like the recordings that you will have like on Spotify or other places, and put links to like if people want to get like albums or things like that. But also to create a little bit of a world music repertoire based on the like preferences and tastes of the people that are being interviewed. And this is a tune that I'm definitely want to go check it out and learn more about it. It's so beautiful. Yeah, and
amazing.
and that's the other thing, like because you were doing like the pentatonic scale, and now that's like using like, let's say, more a different set of scales and notes. And the way you do it there would be basically to play in between the frets and hold it there. How do you get to play like this kind like flats or like this kinds of notes on the pipa?
Yeah, every single fret is a semitone. So if you want a whole tone, you just skip one. And then if you want sharps and flat, you just go up and down. Right?
Oh,
So,
okay.
yeah.
So it's built into it anyway.
Yeah,
In
it's
any
built
case.
into it. Yeah. But then we also have pulls, right? So for example, I'm not sure if we can see this, but I'm using the first string right now, and first string is very soft and very malleable. So we actually pull to the next pentatonic note. So that was a 6. That was an A in D major. So sorry, that would be a B.
Mm-hmm.
Like I have to like think in into Western notation. That would be a B. So in a B, but I was playing D major, so that would be a 6. That would be a La. So that would be under the pentatonic scale. And so the next note is a C, which is a 7. It would be like 1. It would be a like 1 again. So that would be Do. So La to the Do, right? So that's a pentatonic scale. So I have to pull to the Do rather than pull to the let's see, the C sharp. If you're
Right.
like a Western notation, I have to actually pull it to the D. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in order to accommodate for that pentatonic scale, so it definitely play into like the pentatonic scale in terms of like tonations. Definitely get integrated. Actually, it's less obvious. It's not like, oh, this piece only uses D, like the C, D, E, G, and A, therefore it's pentatonic. It's not that simple. Yeah.
That's amazing, and that I guess we can segue. And again, thank you so much for all your like information and passion for the people. Just transpires. It's so nice to see. And like, given, let's take a little bit to the because we talk a lot about the like traditional music and like where it comes from. But I know since you are like in Canada, there is a lot of opportunities to like play with the musicians from like from other traditions or with other kinds of music. Um, how has that been for you, not only in terms of now that I learned that even like a Chinese orchestra is somewhat of like a new invention, which is an amazing thing. How is your experience now like playing with musicians from other cultures, not only from Western music but from all the walks of life that you find in Toronto? I'm always curious to see like, and even your experience in Vancouver too, like how is your experience with musicians from other cultures and integrating the pipa into their music and vice versa?
Yeah, so I find that for a lot of the Asian cultures, so when I played with Gaigum or like Korean, the taiko drums from Japan, and some of the Japanese like musicians and their instruments, is that we have very similar tastes in what the notes should be, what the chord should be. I don't even have to hear a song before I can predict what that next note is. That's how the intuition works, right? For a lot of the musicians, because their culture and the music culture is so similar. They all influence each other in a way. So what I find, I played with a lot of Persian and Persian musicians as well, and what I find with Persian music that takes me a while to adapt is the F sharp. No, sorry, not F sharps. Yeah, F
F
sharps.
sharps.
And, yeah, the F sharps and all the chromatics. So that's something that you don't ever see in Chinese music, and if we ever do chromatics, we're just gonna do the lazy man's way and slide, you know. So like in Chinese music, chromatics is just not a thing, and F sharps is just not a thing, right? So and different type of keys or different type of minor keys and all that stuff. That's something that Chinese music don't have, is the minor keys, and that kind of developed my skills in a different way. And it took me a while, but I was able to, once you kind of understand what that music is about, you can kind of improvise on top of that. And you can add your own Chinese or your own culture's like flair to that improv. without breaking what that like piece's bass sounds like, right? For Western ones, I find I've done a lot of contemporary type of music, both in Chinese culture, written by Chinese people as well as Western people. I find that contemporary wise, one of the things that Pipa is really weak at is chords. So people look at Pipa, this instrument, and they write a lot of chords. And chord is something that it works in a more traditional sense because we have set like open strings and set intervals between the strings. However, a lot of the chords, especially when it become a little bit more contemporary, is not doable in terms of fingering or how fast it can be. So they underestimate how like there are better instruments for chords in Chinese music. That's what I'm talking about. Like for example, the guzheng, which is like a Chinese harp. There are definitely way better instruments for chords than us. The dulcimer is good with chords too. The dulcimer is almost like a piano in a way where they do arpeggios and all that stuff. So they're a lot better with chords than we are this instrument. This instrument is more melodic. So give us more long lines, give us more rhythmic type of like stuff we can definitely do. I find that for Western instruments, collaborating with the piano sounds great. Collaborating with any sort of like string instrument sounds great too, where I will be more of the rhythm aspect, and that's fine too. Yeah, I've done like for Western instruments, I never feel there is a clash. There hasn't been a clash. There's a learning curve with Persian instruments, but
Yes. Mm-hmm.
other than that, there has never been clash. I've done collaboration with tar. I've done collaboration with oud and all that stuff, and it's there is no clash. It sounds beautiful. Absolutely. And it kind of speaks to the fact that music is a common language through everything. And if you understand the pattern, the fabric of music, it doesn't matter what type of instruments that you use in order to achieve that. It's still beautiful, right? So.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thanks for sharing that. And that's a very interesting thing that happens that I was always very interested in what happens at the borders between countries. So, for example, like you have like the music of, for example, Bulgaria, and then in the border with Turkey, they will, of course, there's a lot of, back then at the time, the fastest you could go was on a horse, right? So it's, the music would travel, but it would travel a little bit slowly. And today, you literally can have a person on a Persian santur and a person on a Chinese pipa, literally like 10 kilometers away, and they can collaborate. So it starts creating a kind of like new borders everywhere. Like that's sort of like how I see this, that people can actually play around and do interesting collaborations. And in the case of, also for Persian music, you also have everything being in 6/8, right? With a very specific like beat that is, I remember I was playing like Arabic and Persian in the Turkish music, and then when I got into like playing tombak and other like the Persian instruments, the beat was so different where the accents are, so you have to really get used to it. So that's quite fascinating. So that's like a little talk with about fusion that you've been doing. And I guess we could, because I don't want to take that much of your time, but I guess you can show that other instrument you wanted to show us, because that would be awesome. The one that you're going to show. Mm-hmm.
I need to go and get it, but
that's fine. Yeah, we'll just use the magic of the editing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. I'll go get it, and then I need to take out my nails. So
oh, sure. Yeah, that's okay.
As I do this, I can speak to you a little bit about my experience with collaborating some of the really unique projects that's happening in Toronto right now.
Yes, please.
So I just finished, first of all, last year I did a thing where it's a production by the Canadian Opera Company, and it's called The Monkey is King, and they use half Chinese instrument and half Western. So they use the string quartet, and they use the harp, they use the piano, they use the full percussion, and they used 3 Chinese instruments in order to accommodate, accompany a whole opera. So that was a very exciting project that was happening in Toronto. The other one that I just finished recording was called Project Room 217, and this is a recording project that I found really unique, because I'm also a naturopathic doctor by trade, so I deal with a lot of cancer palliative type of like patients on a regular basis, as well as music. So Project 217 is spearheaded by some like a musician and also a psychotherapist, and they are trying to create world music, similar to what you were saying, world music, but also culture at the same time. So they have different regions. They break down the music into different regions, like the East Asia, the African, whatever. It's more specific to that cultural space, specific people. And for those people who are, say, in palliative care, in hospitals, in chemotherapy wards, where it's wordless type of music, so there is no lyrics to them, but it will activate aspects of their brain where they, because of the cultural similarities, that they can relate to the music, right? So I was in a focus group that's very specific for the East Asia aspect of it. So we're trying to make it as like strip away all the politics, strip away all the history, and speak to people of all Asia, like East Asia, like in a similar musical sense. And there is no music, there is no written music, right? So we will go into the studio not knowing what, and then we will have the first person lay down a bass of like what the music would sound like, and then the second person come into the studio, record on top of that, third person come into the studio, record on top of that. So they will have 5 different artists recording on top of, like, kind of playing off of what they hear, and then the editing at the end of it will just kind of like fade some people out in the background and bring this instrument in and all that stuff to collaborate, to put into one like holistic piece that speaks to the people culturally. And they took care to select their musicians too. It's from Toronto, so we have a huge world music based musician, and they took from different cultures, different type of instruments from different parts of not just China but Korea, from Japan, from like the Mongolia, from like the Tibetan, and like the monk type of like chanting is also in there too. So like things like that, right? So they took aspects of like different aspect of it, and they made a whole album, a whole CD album of it. I don't know if the final project is done or not, or it's in the production phase, but this is something that I find that as Canadians, as Toronto residents and musicians, it's very exciting that we have people like that to think in terms of music fusion and to be of service to different type of culture. That is very good.
Yeah, that's amazing.
That's exciting.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. It's I get like, if you could see like on my like goosebumps, like, because it's very near and dear to the stuff that I like to work with. Even like my group is like called the Blue Dot Ensemble. So it's like the idea is to literally get together music from all over the world, and the blue dot is the earth seen from really far away. It's an idea from Carl Sagan, and we started with the Middle East and started going into getting this transition to music from different places. So interesting you were talking about this, and we'll talk off air about this other project that we were doing. That Sanaz and I had the same idea, and it's something related to this idea of like having one musician create a bass and then give it to another person. And that's it's so interesting that it's on the zeitgeist, and it's such a Toronto thing that it's I guess the permission that we have in the city And this will be seen in other places. It looks like I'm trying to get everybody to go to Toronto to go play music, but it is really a very collaborative culture. And I really liked what you're saying. I didn't know about this when I was like looking into your work. Like this aspect of like healing through music. That's quite. We of course see that in our lives all the time, and to be able to practice this even in a more, let's say, rigorous way, and having access to patients and making a difference in their lives. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I'm very curious about it.
Yeah, so music activates different parts of the brain. So for me, I practice my craft like any other naturopathic doctors do. So it's just that the difference is because I know music scene a lot more, right? So I see patients who are anxious, depressed, or who are going through a tough time in their lives and stuff like that. And one of the things I notice about them is that music, if they make time for it, if they allow it to actually be a part of their lives, it will heal, especially for those patients who has had a music background, right? So people who has learned music in the past, who has sang a lot or like to sing a lot, right? So those type of patients, especially working with elderlies like Alzheimer patients, Parkinson patients, people who has PTSD, that type of music activates a different part of the brain, allows you to speak to them when the words fail. So that is something that I absolutely see over and over again. People with ADHD, ADD kids, they would find rhythm when they can't even speak, right? People with Alzheimer's who would forget what their doctor or daughter's names, or who they are, what their children are, but they will remember some of the songs that they sang to their kids when they're younger, and they will sing that. Like it's a activity that activates different part of brain, and we don't know that much about music therapy at this point in time, because psychology is such a new field as well. But music therapy, where they can connect lost synapses, like connection in the brain, where you would think that that person forgot, but not really. You just need to kind of renew that connection, and music is the trigger to renew that connection again. So it's wonderful to see what music and how powerful music can be, right? And that's the other part of it too. So I'm gonna stop here.
No, that's amazing.
And grab that instrument.
And what's the name again of this instrument?
Ruan, R-U-A-N.
Right. Okay. Perfect. Mm-hmm.
So picks, like not exactly like guitar picks, but similar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they use in Saz, I think, something similar to this, and it has two holes on the, so that you can have like it's just lit like an oud, I guess, on the. Yeah.
So when I said cheese wheel with a stick, that's exactly.
It's exactly what it is. Oh, so beautiful. It's such an interesting instrument. It's and then the technique. It's like for plucking, it's probably very much like other string instruments that you would play with. And then the scales would be basically like the frets. Everything will be like it's more of the sound, the structure of it will make it sound the way it does, right? Especially the bass sound that is so beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
amazing.
absolutely. Yeah, so this is usually used in the, like, you can hear the whole bass sounding of it. And there is a bigger one. The bigger one, I can't even like put my hand around it. So usually guys play those because they have longer arms than me. But the bigger one will be like the bass equivalent of like the bass.
Right. Yeah.
Right? So that's usually what's used in Chinese orchestras. That's probably one of the lowest instrument that we have that is traditional.
Uh-huh. No, that's beautiful. Yeah, thanks for showing that because that one I haven't seen it yet, so it's fascinating to see. And not to take much more of your time, but one thing I wanted to ask you. So your projects you mentioned, you're like you have the therapy side, you have the playing with the traditional Chinese music, and you have the fusion, and you teach as well, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Are you teaching in a school, or you teach like on your own for private students? How do you how do you take that?
Yeah, so I used to teach in schools and stuff like that, but then I realized that with the limited time I have a full practice. I have a, like, in terms of my naturopathic um,
Hmm.
aspect, like being a doctor, I have a full practice. So because of that, I only take private students right now, just like one-on-one lessons, because that's easier for me to deal with the timing and all that stuff. I do have performances um, that it comes in waves. Like all musicians know that it comes in waves. It doesn't. It's not like a steady thing, right? So it comes in waves. So sometimes I have to like shift things around. So that's one of the reasons why I quit being in school, because of the fact that it's not that flexible in terms of time, but definitely one-on-one. Yeah.
And I guess because of the context in which we are recording this, we should mention, before I ask you the final question about this, like, how is your life these days in terms of like, because we are all musicians that are stranded wherever we are, and everybody around the world with the pandemic have to deal with our work. If you have like, of course, you have another practice like in health, so that will be impacted in different ways. But did you start like teaching online, or did you put that on hold for now? How is that affecting your practice there?
So, speaking from a quarantine perspective, I've always been teaching online. So I had students from Brazil, Argentina. I have students from US who my thing is that you come in and visit me like once in a while, like once a year or even less than once a year, um, where I can actually see some of the techniques in more than a 2D perspective. But I do teach them on a regular basis online, and that's I have support videos for them. My YouTube channel is not very like I don't do anything fancy with my videos. I just record and send it out. I sometimes make the video public, but usually I'm talking. I make the video specifically for the students who are doing one-on-one with me, so they're like, oh, I'm not quite understanding this technique, then I will make a video. And if that video is happens to benefit more than just him or like her, then
Mm-hmm.
I will probably make it public and then link it to my like to other people who might need it. So my YouTube video is very bare minimum, bare bones, but um, to me it's not like I'm trying to populate my followers. I'm trying to just provide a service to the people who really do have a online type of learning type of thing. I do also um, like I already teach online. anyways. So
Mm-hmm.
just transitioning some of my in-person students to online for the time being. There are also wonderful, wonderful musicians out there who are doing concerts at home and concerts on Instagram and all that stuff. And I think it's wonderful they're doing that, live streaming some of their own concerts that it was supposed to happen and all that stuff. So people are finding ways to still be a musician in this time of need, and that's what's important.
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting that you mentioned that like you're already working with online like platforms and everything. And one of the things that I was thinking is how you have this ancient instrument that was passed on, like the teaching was like directly into one-on-one, and actually in one generation you're able to, in a way, popularize it with the people that would like not have access to it online. So it's quite fascinating that you're able to keep doing it, and having people from all over the world like learning with you. We'll have links for your like YouTube channel and online presence. So if people want to learn more about the Pipa and about your work, they can go there. And the last thing I wanted to ask you is, I started asking this a couple of episodes ago, and
Yeah.
it's for you, like you can talk to you can approach this question from like your experience with Chinese music in general, or with the Pipa specifically, or like anyhow you want. But like, what's the thing that makes like for you the music that you play or the culture that you learn like unique? Or what's the thing that whenever you're playing you're thinking like, oh, I wish people would get this thing? Like what's the thing in the music that you play and the cultures that you express that are actually that you would like people to get out of it? Like what kind of feeling, or what kind of thoughts, or what kind of experience?
I want them to, one of the things, because I've done a lot of like show and tells and in terms of like concerts and all that stuff, so at museums across Toronto. And one thing that I started changing the way I do those show and tells is actually kind of describing the instruments, describing the pieces I'm playing. So I want people to realize that Chinese pieces always have a story, and if you're a musician, whoever it is that's playing a traditional Chinese piece, don't actually know what the piece is like describing, they're not quite there yet. So there's a difference between playing the notes for the notes and playing music with the notes, right? So
Hmm.
in order to get to that music aspect of it, to truly get something out of listening and not just looking at the people or looking at the instrument and go like, oh, this is new, this is fascinating, the techniques looks great, this, I've never seen this before. That's what most people think about when they look at people, right? But I kind of like, especially those people that has a music background, like those audience that has a music background, I want them to actually feel the music. I want them to understand, like, for example, I'm gonna give you a link. I did this performance when I was about 18, back in Vancouver with the Vancouver BC Chinese Orchestra, and I was playing this piece called Mulan, or Mulan, right? So we all know what the story is behind Mulan, Mulan's journey and all that stuff. It is a real story that got kind of cartoonized and turned into a story. And there are pieces like that. So I'm going to link you that concerto. It's a Pipa concerto, Pipa and Chinese Orchestra concerto. And when people hear that story or hear that music, I want them to see the story. I want audience to feel the battle. I want them to see the decision, the peaceful times that she had when she's at home, coming home after a long battle, you know, that type of thing, right? So what that feels like for her, the internal struggles that she has to go through, the peaceful life she had before she left, and like all that is actually very, very well depicted in the piece, right? In that whole entire piece. It's 2 parts YouTube video, and I think it's stories like that that makes music come alive, and that's what I want audience to feel whenever they hear my music, at least, right? So I always strive to understand what I'm playing. So which part of that, yes, it will look like certain things on the music notation, but it's actually someone crying, or the hoofbeats of a battle, or the armors clinking together, or things like that, right? So what is it actually describing in that specific scenario? That is when you truly can appreciate music.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, thank you for that. That's to go beyond and actually be understood. It's sort of like that holy grail of music and art and
Right.
culture. Yeah, so yeah, I really appreciate it. Wendy, where should people go? Like, we're gonna have links and everything on this episode, but if people want to follow your work, what's the best way to connect with you, and even to eventually even get classes, or like to, if they're really hooked with the people, like, where is the best way to find your work?
Yeah, so I'm actually I have some time now because quarantine. I'm actually for the past few years, a lot of people have approached me in terms of like CD albums and stuff like that. I don't do that. I don't have time to do those type of things. I would like to eventually, but what I've been doing is that I've been collecting people's emails and stuff like that in terms of like or contact information in general, because I'm actually thinking about launching, say, IG or my own website and stuff like that, just about like Pipa, and teaching people about the instrument in English, because a lot of people who wants to learn are like the teachers are in Chinese. They teach,
Yes.
right? So so I'm providing that type of thing. So in terms of lessons, they can always reach me through email. It's peoplelessons@gmail.com, or they can just like reach me through like, I'm planning to launch a IG page or Facebook page for specifically for that reason. So I can add everyone there once that has been done. So for now, just like kind of email me. I have my
Mm-hmm.
personal emails as well. I don't mind doing that too, and just email me that way. And that I do both online lessons and in person. If you live in Toronto and it is convenient, I always prefer in person, just because, especially when you're first learning things, there are techniques where 3D is better than 2D. So,
Mm-hmm. For
yeah,
sure. Mm-hmm.
yeah. So, but options, there are tons of options. I
And to
am,
see your performances, would they be on YouTube, or do you like, or for, like, for your recordings? Basically, like, email would be the best way for people
yeah,
to contact.
yeah, because you see, I haven't in the past, like all my performances, like I have tons actually on YouTube. Maybe some I'm not even aware of, but it's not like from myself, right? So I did not upload these. Other people have uploaded of my performances in the past. I have tons of like performances coming up that kind of got canceled due to the whole coronavirus thing, but
Right.
definitely like in the future, like when things are back to normal again, I will always be having new exciting projects. I am less of a performer nowadays than I am more of an educator. I'm more of a exploring composition and conducting nowadays, but I definitely still perform tons, and I definitely teach tons as well right now.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah. Also, like, I was going to finish now, but I actually need to ask you that. Otherwise, it will be my bane, because I've been asking a lot of the people that are like coming to the show, and you probably have a very different and like interesting approach to actually composition, considering all these things that you're talking about, of this visualization of scenes and of environments. Like, what's your approach to, if you have, like, it's open-ended question, but your approach to composition, like, when you
Yeah.
get to a piece, do you imagine a scene, or are you trying to incorporate, how's your approach?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, because I have my first love is Chinese music, and my first exposure to music and music theory is Chinese way of doing things, not the Western way of doing things. So when I do composition, a lot of it has to do with sceneries. So I have to write out a story first. I have to put things into different sections like A, B, C, and whatever, and I use music to to almost like describe the story itself. One of my last pieces that I've done is called Torrent, and it's inspired by like the White Rapid Niagara Fall aspect of it, and it's using Chinese instrument but also layering, so almost like a bit of using box like counterpoint and layering one after another. It's like describing the waves clashing over each other, right, as they go a certain directions and into a whirlpool and all that stuff. So a lot of those compositions based off of the music aspect is actually supposed to describe a scenery that I felt, how I felt when I saw it, and the way things are in music form, right? So like that's basically what all artists wants, like you said, is to be understood in that way, right? And knowing that inspiration to that composition is the beginning of how someone can actually understand. Sorry, let me plug my computer in.
That's okay. No, that's amazing. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And yeah, with that we can leave. Wendy, it was a pleasure to talk to you for the show, and we'll put links to everything, and hopefully I'll get to jam with you sometime soon.
Yes, looking forward to meeting you in person.
Yeah, for sure. Awesome.